of the stories I share and of the suggestions I make about connecting grandparents and legacy, trees and eco-creation within a vessel or a container called WELLth, WELLth, there is a presentation language that I use that is made up of numbers and words and visuals. And I wanted to present that to you today so that you might be able to get a sense of what it is and where I'm using it and how I'm using it so that you would have an interpretation guide as you interact with me. And so welcome, welcome, Dr. Stephen Hobbs here from the WELLth Movement. And this is a Thursday perspective presentation for March the 4th, 2021. And as I mentioned, there's a presentation language that I want to go over made up of words, numbers, and visuals. And I'm going to set it in motion by sharing a little bit of the background of how I came to make up this presentation language. Another way that I refer to it is the WELLth language. And then to share with you what I call the 10-dimensional learning and education pathway. And I will do that in a visual format for you. But this background information I wanted to share gives you an insight into how it unfolded for me. And some of it you might find of interest, and it might stimulate you to go look for a bit more information. And I will put more in the show more notes below or around this video. But also, if you just want to jump to the visual language itself, I have put a timestamp just down below, and you can just click and jump to that point. Before I get into it in great depth, make sure you subscribe, ring the bell, comment, like, and share. And that would be great because then we can learn together. So of the visual language, numbers, words of the language, this presentation language that I'm going to share with you, there's a couple of things that started me off. Obviously, in my younger years, I was writing poetry, and it was the use of words to try and explain what was happening to me, to bring the imagery of the environment to me, and just write about my experiences. And so I started to get abstract and concrete in the use of my words, and that's just part of being a poet. Also, what was happening is that I was working as a draftsperson. I had learned about drafting while I was in high school, and I ended up working for a short time on electronics diagrams and being able to work with them in such a way is that I actually ended up doing the printing on the diagrams. I started off, it was kind of an interesting story. I was given my first diagram to work with, and I did my work, handed it in, and the supervisor went, I'm going to have to give this to someone else because we can't use the printing that you've used. And I said, what do you mean? And then he explained, I said, okay, show me how you want me to do it and give me another diagram. He said, okay, here we go. Gave another diagram. I came back and said, if you can keep this up, one of the things that you'll do is you'll be doing a lot of the printing onto the diagrams so that when we go to replicate them, to produce them for use, they'll be legible. And so I got to be known as one of the printers on the diagram. So that was kind of neat, and it was led me to use a similar style. Some of it is here in terms of that printing style. This is a little bit more as I grow a little bit older, I get a little bit looser around the use of it, but it's sort of, there's some elements of it here. So I did that from the writing poetry, the drafts person. And then what happened was I got introduced to something called M by N matrices in an algebra, a higher math perspective. And I started to go, well, what's this about? Not so much about how do I use the M by N matrices, but what was it stimulating in my thinking? And it was giving me more an imaginative look at the world, that there was more dimensions to the world than was noticing. And I remember looking at diagrams, and a lot of them are what we call 2D. Einstein would talk about the two-dimensional drawings that we made. And I went, oh, this is interesting. And then I started to recognize, well, maybe there's other ways in which to draw it. And that's where the draftsperson story comes in again, is that I started to look at how do you draw things in 3 dimensions. And that started to unfold another way for me to look at the world and learn to draw from that perspective, like using that horizon line and the path going into the horizon line. The other thing that I became exposed to was the beginning of research. And research was about the search and how I might use it in an academic setting. If there was a question, how do I pursue the answering of the question? And I started to realize there was more than just numbers to research. Words were important, and also visuals in terms of portraying the data. And I started to just start putting all of this together. And then when I was going back to university for my second time, I went to an advanced learning program. And at that one, I learned about this visual language concepts, in particular, mind mapping. And I'll reference Tony Bazan here. And I learned that I was actually a visual learner. And the way that I took notes before, which are like just lists, weren't doing it for me. And what I did was I started to draw what I was hearing in the classroom, drawing my thinking out. And I just learned that I became a visual learner, and it actually increased my grades, reduced the amount of studying I had to do. And my recall was unbelievable when I went to write my exams. And it was very, very helpful as I moved through my own studies. But then it started to really pop out for me, this visual language, when I was doing work in Africa around relief work and development work. And there was just so many variables that were at play when you're doing studies. Like I was doing HIV and AIDS at the time, also doing a tree planting program, and another one was running a relief operations using aircraft. And the variables that you had to play with and think through, I went, how can I portray this? How can I understand it? And that's when I started to develop this 10D approach, a 10-dimensional approach. It's a language that I use. It helps me a great deal to share what I am talking about, what I am putting up for people to learn through, a tool technique to learn through. And that's why I'm going to share my visual language, my WELLth language with you. But there was another element that started to pop in as I've gotten a little bit older, and it's around this notion of sense making and being more intuitive to what's taking place. Now, I'm not saying as you get older, you're going to become more intuitive. There are young people who are quite intuitive, but again, this is a story I'm sharing about the presentation language that came forward for me. And this intuitiveness that's really making sense of all of my senses really started to show up. And with the visual language I created, I could start to use colors slightly differently. I use the chakra colors, for example. I started to figure out how words, when you look at words, inside the words, there is so much that's going on. There's another video where I take the word evolve and I show where love is there, about the love of your history, and where love is there going forward, love of the mystery. And lo and behold, when you love your history and when you love your mystery, you're present. I'll put a link to that video below as well. And so this notion of a presentation language started to really come forward for me. And because I'm using a lot of it in my presentations, my videos, I thought that I would shoot this video so that there was a reference point for you when you came to understand what I was sharing at the time. And therefore, I'm now going to unpack this language and the use of the diagrams and the words and the numbers as they come together in the WELLth language. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to share two videos here. The first video is the short version of the WELLth language that I use. And the second one is a bit more involved, more detailing of what's possible. A starting point is to think of ourselves as a three-dimensional being. And I'm going to draw it like this. And this is a person with a walking stick. It could be you, it could be me. And we are, in a sense, three dimensions. We have back and front, side to side, top to bottom. We are three dimensions. And what we do is that we walk a path. And if you are watching other videos that I have done, this is the perspective path, perspective map that I use. It could be the path of learning and educating, the path of extraordinary experiences. It has many ways to take a look at whatever that path is about, because that path is the next three dimensions. So we have the three dimensions associated with ourselves. The three dimensions associated with the path are going to be time, space, and what I call knowing. So we're walking the path over a certain time. It's taking into consideration the space that we're walking in. But because there's this learning and educating, there's a sense of knowing that is taking place, being able to make sense of what's unfolding for you as you are walking along. That meant that if we're doing this three-dimensional me, walking this three-dimensional path, I then found out that there was three more dimensions that I would add to that around the sense of transition. So this area is about transition. And I learned that there is the notion of the transaction, there is the transformation, and there is the transcendence aspect. And these are transition in response to the change that's coming to us. There is change that's influencing us. There's change that is influencing us as we walk our path. There is this notion of change, and how we respond to it is called the transition. And therefore, of the actions we do on a day-to-day basis, how might we be able to improve them, focus them, strengthen them? There is the, well, maybe we have to shift the form of what it is that we're doing. And we may have to take a different path. We may have to add more to the path, take something away from our interactions with the path. And then there's transcendence, which is why it's open here, is we sort of go to somewhere we don't quite know where we're going, but hope and faith join us on our trip. We're going to be sent to somewhere. And what it does is it allows for the day-to-day movement, as it allows for this bigger picture movement that we're on. And it just opened up so much. So I said, okay, there's three dimensions, another three dimensions, another three dimensions. And if I added those together, that made 9. And I work with what's called 9+1 lists, because I learned over time is that if I add one more, it becomes 10. And it's very interesting from a numbers perspective that 10 is the binary code used in the computers about yes or no. And I went, well, hang on a minute, then that means then if all of this is interacting with each other, I got to a point where I had what I called the portal. To go through the portal was, yes, I go through that portal, or no, I don't. And when I went through it, I was going, okay, then that starts me up for a new pathway. And it presents me with a new me. And we might go, oh, wow, this learning that I've taken from this interaction and being able to, oh, okay, create something new for myself. It gives me a chance to walk and go through a portal and go, oh, I have another interpretation of my wealth, my well-being, my well-living to the nth degree. And therefore, I just started to use this mapping tool to be able to, how do I get to my yes versus my no takes me away from going through the portal, taking that step into my improvement, focus, and strengthen, which is about being for the world. So this is a quick presentation about the wealth language so that you might understand that there is you as a three-dimensional being. You're walking a path in time, space, and the knowing that you're gathering, the possibilities, you do transaction, transformation, or transcendence. And therefore, when you go to make decision about where you're going to go and what's happening, you can either go your yes or no and take the direction accordingly. If no, then something in here needs to be shifted around to be able to get your yes. And when you've done your yes, you find yourself, okay, I have leveraged something, I have grown, I have built something, and you continue the journey. The next element of the video that you've got here is going to go into it in a little bit more depth. And what I do is I start with a dot and then create the story out from the dot. Again, WELLth, which is about well-being and well-living to the nth degree, was a creation that has unfolded over the last 30 some years. And as I mentioned, there is lots of ways in which I've been impacted by different tools and techniques. Some of them actually born out of just my own internal thinking and feeling and sense making. And what I'm going to do now is give you a progression of those 10 dimensions that I find to be of great value in moving forward. I went so far as to actually write my doctoral thesis on those 10 dimensions. I did it from a organization learning and adult education perspective, because that's what I was studying at the time, and how to use it to look at the organization of work, the learning in the workplace. I'm not going to go from that perspective. I'm going to use more of a generic perspective right now. So the starting point for all of this is the sense of the dot and what it might represent. So I call this my perspective dot. And it's a way to remind myself of at what level, what viewpoint am I looking at? Because this dot, if I was out on Pluto, out there on Neptune and looking back, it would be a dot on the landscape, on the spacescape. Or I could say that that's actually an element inside of a cell, which is inside of another aspect of the cell. Again, it depends if I'm down in the quantum level or I'm out in the cosmos level. But it's also could represent a big period at the end of a sentence. Okay, so there's lots of uses for this dot. Another way that I could look at that dot was I could turn it into a circle where I'm not filling it in, and it can represent lots of other ideas associated with the language that's going to unfold. So I just wanted to acknowledge that it doesn't always have to be darkened in. It can be open in that way as well. Now, what takes place here is that I could then add a line, and I could suggest it's going from like this sense of A to B. And it would give what they sometimes call like a vector. It has a direction to it, and it could explain lots of ways about looking at time and space. And that's usually how we draw our stick people, and be able to understand how we might look at a person. So a stick person is just a series of lines and the notion of that circle to represent the head. So that's one of the ways in which we can unfold this two dimensions. So if you want to think of the dot as one dimension, this notion of the line was two dimensions. And that's how I learned so much of my work. And I would draw things. But what started to take place was, what would happen if I then added another line? And I went, well, this is kind of interesting. It's because now I could create what were called 2x2 tables. And you've seen them all over the place, and other kinds of tables, but normally the 2x2, where you've got a sense of something like that, where you're comparing one thing against another. And what does each of those areas on that 2x2 table represent? So I learned how to draw lots of these different kinds of tables and looking at the relationship. And let me give you one, is that I might look at what happens externally against what takes place internally. So if I was to take a look at my business as an example, external would be my customers and clients. My internal would be myself and those who I work with, and what happens when we interact with one another. There was a 2x2 table way of looking at these lines. And then I said, what would happen is if I drew another line out from here, what might take place? And that's when I started to realize is that there's something about three dimensions that are possible here. And I went, oh, this is kind of interesting. And I kept playing with it and playing with it. And I realized, wow, this actually forms something that would be synonymous with a cube. So my three dimensions, the cube started to come forward. And then what was really interesting is I started to go, well, if I actually put the letter A here, and I was to ask myself, where was it placed in this three-dimensional box? I could go, well, it's in the back, it's in the middle, or it's on the front. And all of a sudden I went, hang on, so I can actually see through this. And it started to then open up more possibilities of ways to explain all these different kind of variables that were in play. And that's when I started to come up with other ways in which to use this language. And I came to understand something about things like, what are the external variables that influence what's taking place? So social, cultural, technological, environmental, economic, political. Then I said, okay, how might I work internally to deal with them? And I came up with SHIMS, all right, which is Stakeholders Horizontal Integrated Management System. And then I realized that there's something like I could do something around something called STORY. And what it is strategy, tactics, operations, relevance, and answering the question why. And therefore, when I made this, remember we did the 2x2 table? Now we did the cube, and it would be 5x5x5. And therefore, there would be 125 of those smaller squares inside of that bigger square. So you can see all of a sudden, I could map out even more in terms of relationships between what was taking place inside the cube. So it just opened up more and more ways in which to take a look at things. And what happened is that all of this then gave rise to a dimensional view of what was taking place. I started to then add another way to look at it, and this is the sense of the arrow, where what we're doing is, if this is where we start at A, then it means when we get to B, in other words, when we go from A to B, there's this perspective sense that's taking place. Where that came from was when I started to understand about horizons. So if we're drawing in and we're drawing in, you can see where if you're walking, there's a horizon line, you pop in behind that hill, so to speak, and you get the path and you continue on, continue on. It started to open up this notion of the geography of whatever it is that I was looking at. And it just opened up a lot more possibilities for me. And it's this diagram, which I call my perspective diagram, or my path of learning and educating, my path of extraordinary experiences, was a way to explain the movement of whatever it was that I was looking at. So in the sense was, over the time that variable that we're looking at, there is some sense of space that's being taken up by this, and there is a sense of shift that is taking place. So if I'm on this path and I'm moving forward, there's a time and space, and it suggests things are going to happen in there. And I use this in a lot of ways to be able to explain with you how important it is to be engaged in movement. Another area is profitability. These are ways in which to take a look at it. It's a way in which to hold ideas together. And that's where this perspective arrow came out. So moving it from a perspective dot to a perspective arrow. So what happened was that I went and took this 1 dimension, 2 dimension, it went into a sense of 3 dimension. Then what happened is it went into time, space, and the concept of knowing. Because as you're moving forward, you're getting to know things. And what happened was I could say, okay, there's the 4th dimension, the 5th dimension, and the 6th dimension. Remember, I was going to share with you 10. So these were just ways for me to explain the variables that were in place and how we're going to look at it. So you could say, okay, what's ever inside this cube, how's it moving out? But if you remember, there was smaller cubes in there. So how could each cube be moving? So you could see, wow, I could take into consideration lots and lots of stuff. And that's why we're in a world where computers can be very helpful in working this data system. But from a drawing point of view, it's ways for me to be able to portray what it is that I'm talking about, the stories I want to share, the suggestions I want to make. Then with the realization about this 3D up to 6D now, it was, this is giving the dimensionality to the project I might be working on, or the idea I'm working on, or it could even be me walking along this path. I started to go, okay, if that's 3 dimension, what would be 6 dimension? I got it. And I went, what would happen if I was to add 3 more to it based on the concept of transition, which is the response to what is taking place, so the response to the change that's influencing whatever the object is and the path that we're taking. So what of the change that's influencing me, if I'm this 3-dimensional being here, what is being represented, and I am now living in time and space, and I'm engaged in knowing and learning and educating, I went, okay. So I found out about transition. the response to it. And I went, well, this is interesting. And how many elements of transition are there? And I found there was three main ones. And I went, oh, lovely. So what happened is that I got the seventh, eighth, and ninth dimensions associated with my WELLth language. And I went, oh, this is great. And I found out that the seventh dimension is about transaction, is that across the actions we take, how do we improve the actions on a day-to-day basis? And then I went, okay, well, the next one is transformation, which is how do you shift the form of something over this notion of time and space and the knowing you do. And then I said, oh, okay, then the third one, or what we would call the ninth dimension, became transcendence, which is sending something somewhere without really knowing where you're going and what's going to take place. There's a bit of hope and faith associated with that story. And I went, oh, this is great. So I've got a tangible transition, and then I've got this sort of faith, hope, transcendence that was offering it to me. And I said, oh, this starts to open up even more possibilities. And I said, is there a 10th to this? And that's when I went, I guess there is, because if I was to add the 10th one, so add one more to it, it becomes what I call the amoeba or the portal. And that's where what you do is you pass through the portal. In a sense, you start it all over again. And let me give you a sense of that. Remember down here where I talked about the blackened in dot or the circle? I realized after time is that it isn't really a circle blacked in and a circle. It's a bit more of an amoeba. And I went and looked up what amoeba means. And amoeba means to change. It's an organism that is changing to its habitat, its environment. And because I'm looking at ecosystems, I went, oh, okay. So really, this is a way to start it. And if I continue it up to here, and I call it now a portal, having added all of these different dimensions to it, then when I pass through that portal, I'm in a sense starting this all over again. And therefore, what would take place, the language that I would use, the visual language, is that I'm going through and what would happen is that I would start to make these travels through time and space to be able to explain what's going on. And I went, this is really neat. And what it then meant to me was, remember I talked about the two dimensions, the line, is that the line isn't straight. What I'm looking for is the straightest line. And that opened up another possibility, because what that reminded me of, where I might have go for the straight line, go for perfection, it's actually about progression because there is shifts along the way. And I just went, well, this opens up so much more and offers me ways to share the stories, make suggestions that have multi-dimensional explanations and descriptions with them. And I just went, oh, this is really neat. And therefore, this whole palette of possibilities and opportunities opened up for me. And I've just been able to add to it over time. And so I wanted to share it with you so that you might get a sense that it's more than just a three-dimensional object, or the notion I'm three-dimension, right? Back and front, top and bottom, side to side, okay, 3 dimensions. So I could look at myself and the path that I'm walking, and how does time, space, and my knowing influence, and the kind of transitions that I'm going through. And then when I hit one of my portals, in many ways, I'm taking that and I'm leveraging, or what I prefer is I'm leveraging the next part of my journey, or the next whole of my journey. And it just helped me to understand this, that from these extraordinary experiences, I go to another extraordinary experience, another extraordinary experiences, and it gave me this very beautiful way of looking at what's unfolding for me. And what it then did, and this is sort of where I'll close this one off, I'll come back to this diagram here, is that I realized that the decision I made to go this direction, I could have made another decision and gone in that direction. So what it did was it helped me to understand the decision structure that I use and what's possible as I move through time and space and my knowing. And therefore, I was able to figure out, wow, okay, the decision I made to go work in Africa, which exposed me to all of that really wonderful insights and the challenge of looking at all the variables that are associated with the work that I was doing, it opened up all these possibilities. And there's always that, well, if I hadn't made the decision to go to Africa, where might I have ended up? But the great thing is, by the time we're all done and all of this has worked and worked and worked, you do end up somewhere. And that's when you walk elsewhere. It's a really wonderful way of saying is that when you pass out of this life, this iteration of your life, that's when whatever happened, it culminates, whatever decisions you eventually open up and you could say, guess what? I'm starting all this over again, even though I've gone through many, many, many different portals. I've gotten to that one major portal that might start me all over again. And then that's when opened it up an even greater spiritual look at what's possible for my life and how I might be able to translate it for yourself and have you interpret it back to me. Therefore, we can grow through subscribing, ringing the bell, comment, like, and share. We can interact and support each other as we move forward in our lives and in being for the world. So I'm hoping that this wealth language explanation description might be of support to you. I'm not saying you just go out and adopt it. I offer to you so you might understand how I'm using some of this visual language to make my suggestions, to share the stories, to bring to surface ideas, investigations, interpretations that might be of value for you. So with that, I'm going to leave it and I'm just going to say, take care.